Welcome, everybody. I think we have many more people to come on board, so attendees are still joining. I think it'd be wise for us to pause for a moment. So please bear with us. You can perhaps, while you have, of course, your syllabus, might be thinking about the questions that we're going to be speaking to during the lecture. I think we can appreciate that we've all probably been here for webinars and had technical difficulties. So we'll just take a moment and give everyone time to be here. Thanks for your patience. Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to jump right in. I'd like to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the staff of the National Museum of Bermuda, we're delighted that you can join us and that we understand that some of you may be down the road and others are coming from overseas, and we appreciate you. We know we have our local educators. Thank you so much for joining us, and for our museum members and friends from near and far, thank you again for joining us today. I would like everybody to know that the session is being recorded. And we know that this is the lecture topic. This is why we're here in terms of this #1 slide. I'll speak to the topic in more detail in a moment, but I did want to just quickly have a look at the agenda so that you can see what's coming up next. My name is Lisa Howie. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement at the museum. And we will be having some questions that we'd like for you to respond to. Of course, with the numbers, we're over 70, and with an anticipation of almost 150 today, which is fabulous. The first question will be answered through a chat. And then the second and third questions, we will provide you with a Google Doc link in order for you to provide us with some of your insights. And for those of you who are with us with the first lecture, you know that we do like to have some interactivity. Of course, being virtual, we're going to do our very best to ensure that we capture your thoughts and your questions. As you can see, we have some questions at the end, and we'll do our best to get to those. If we don't get to them today, then we'll respond to you by email. So this is the second lecture in our Atlantic World series. For those who are with us here in March, we started with the early Atlantic, 1250 to 1609, with the question why and how did we get here? And then the following day or the day after, we met with local educators for our first professional development workshop. And that's essentially how each module works. We have the lecture, and then we give an opportunity to provide some PD to our local educators, or educators who, in this case now, being virtual, can be overseas. And we recognize too that some of our parents have jumped into the seat of being teachers, and we welcome you to join us as well. And that workshop is tomorrow, starting at 10 o'clock. And if you haven't registered for it, please do so after this. And I recognize that I didn't capture emails for the first sign up. So please make sure that if you did register, go back, and you may want to make sure your email address is there. And also just, we're trying to see as many people come on board. But if you can't make it, this lecture as well as the session tomorrow, those will be recorded. The Atlantic World lecture series gives us a chance to explore Bermuda's history, which is deeply interconnected with the narratives of Africa, the United Kingdom, Europe, Latin and North Americas, and the Caribbean. And by exploring these connections, we hope to build understanding about how global forces throughout the Atlantic world have helped to shape Bermuda as we know it today. And what a very different world today is. You know, we are embracing this context like many of our museum partners around the world. And we have quickly shifted deeper into the digital realm, offering a new range of online content, such as hosting a lecture like this. If you haven't been onto our website lately, please have a look, because we're really proud of the efforts of our team. And we've got some nice gems there for research and self-growth. There are also perhaps some silver linings as we're describing them to the context today. You know, one of the things that's always a challenge for museums is to meet people where they are. And we can effectively say that we are meeting people where they are at today. We hope that you are home and safe and comfortable. And I think that's a win for museums like ourselves. But we also recognize that this context, this pandemic, has led for many of us to have a greater appreciation of who we are, what we have, gaining a better sense of place, of value for our history and our culture. And I think that, interestingly enough, that this context helps us to frame the importance of knowing our past so that we can better understand our contemporary challenges and together create a better future. And this is so important for our young people who may be suffering severe consternation on where does their future lie and where will they be going next. I really hope that they will follow in the footsteps of our lecturer, Dr. Maxwell, today, who was really switched on by history, and that they will follow his lead. He's going to be delivering today on the topic of building a maritime community, a maritime state, addressing early settlement and economic growth, 1609 to 1800. And we're going to be opening up the key question of what are the critical relationships and adaptations that shaped Bermuda? And such an imperative question for this very moment. So what we really hope is that you have had time to review the syllabus that we provided when you joined us, and that you can take a moment now to share with us your response to our first question, which is what is needed to develop a community? And if you can, challenge yourself to respond to that with just a one-word answer and place that in the chat so that we can all have a quick look at some of the thoughts that you have in mind regarding question number one. So purpose and language, selflessness, communication, self-love. It's interesting, Kushanda, because isn't that a big topic for today, right? Making sure we have self-care. And the understanding and unity, I think that's part of one of our strengths as a culture, while we are bandying together to ensure greater equity in our society. I think we've got such a great opportunity here with all of the merits and demerits that make up Bermuda, make us special and a bit strange and isolated, and perhaps an intensifying Tamara on the sense of belonging. I think that is what we need, and definitely need it as we go further. Definitely patience and empathy. These are issues that I know educators in the room find so important and find ways to bring into every layer of subject matter. And relationships. It's key. This is what we're also trying to do through the lecture series. While yes, it is informative, we also hope that it is embracing, and that perhaps together it strengthens our collective intelligence And that can only have merit and lead to empowering our society more wholly and more completely. Thank you all for sharing. Go ahead to keep responding while we go, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move ahead. I'd like to introduce Dr. Clarence Maxwell. I like to call him our historian rock star. He's got quite the following, and Dr. Maxwell, excuse me. But we all know him as a specialist in Caribbean and Latin American history with a keen interest in Bermuda. Thank goodness we have him, and that his interest extends, of course, also to the African diaspora and the history of the Atlantic enslavement. He's an assistant professor and co-director of the Millersville University Atlantic World Center, and he's a trustee and valued member of the National Museum of Bermuda. And I really loved his quote that we shared in the syllabus, that history is a door to our heritage. And with that, Dr. Maxwell.
Hello.
Thank you so much.
Oh, good afternoon. I would like to begin with the first question. In what ways do our actions and inactions shape Bermuda and the wider Atlantic world? And that's a place we can actually begin to start. This will be a discussion of early settlement, the building of a Bermuda maritime community and state in the Atlantic world from 1609 to 1800, and to discuss how that process developed, how it went from a colony and all of the elements that went towards taking it into the maritime commercial economy. Although, just as a reminder of all the other questions, what was needed to develop a community, how did actions and inactions shape the Bermuda Atlantic world? We're going to take a look at some of these as we go through. My purpose would be to show how Bermuda constructed a maritime commercial state, how it built this community, this not just a maritime state, but also a maritime community, which I will define in a few minutes, from 1609 to 1800s, how it constructed it, the background. That will require several things. Among them, to discuss the context. What was the context for shaping it? The second thing, the actual building of a Bermuda maritime state hydrarchy, which we call a hydrarchy. And the third, the building of a Bermuda maritime community, the background that went to it, into constructing it. And last but not least, what we call, what the co-author called the economics of treason. Let's begin with a couple of definitions. Let's start with the maritime state. We use the term hydrarchy for a particular reason. Hydrarchy combines two ideas, the idea of water, of course, and the idea of archy, dominion, control, dominance, and therefore the idea of a sovereign state controlling and dominating and establishing its order on a maritime community. That construction of a legal and political infrastructure is part of what we mean by a hydrarchy, in which a state or this community goes about the process of constructing a legal infrastructure and a political infrastructure to govern and maintain its maritime and commercial interests overseas. That implies several things. The notion of sovereignty. And I think I know what you're thinking. How can a colony be sovereign? Sovereign implies territorial integrity and political independence. But a lot of this is de facto sovereignty, in which these countries operate, this island operated, or places that developed hydrarchies operated as if they were sovereign countries, regardless of their de jure status. Their de facto actions belied oftentimes their de jure condition. That's the hydrarchy. Let's move to the question of a maritime community. That term, we use the term thalassocracy to imply certain things. We wanted to go away from the notion of a hierarchical system to a system in which one establishes community and certain associations across for a variety of different people, and how you construct a community and how you construct order and establish associations. So the creation of connections and relationships is implied by the notion of ocracy and this idea of establishing connections and associations across the sea. This is, of course, not just, these customs are therefore stabilized by custom stabilized practices so that when you're engaged in trading or commercial activity, you know what to expect. You know what type of relationships are going to be developing, therefore allowing for stabilized relations. And that's sort of what we talk about: markets, establishing market relationships between people, partners, shipboard associations, trade connections, but particularly markets, where you must have several levels of predictability as you engage in trade. That's what we mean by a maritime community. And in this case, an enslaved maritime community that established by people who were enslaved in Bermuda. And therefore, an enslaved thalassocracy. I like to think that history has seven particular aspects, or that to write a narrative of history, there are several different aspects: context, characters, cause, consequence, choices, contradictions, and circumstance events. I like to tell my students these are the 7 rules of history, in which for an historical narrative to be historical, it has to have these 7 elements. So we're going to start with one of those elements, and that is the question of context: how the Atlantic maritime economy established itself in the Atlantic world, in Bermuda, and take a look at both the international context and then take a more narrow perspective about the local and Bermuda context. I'm going to start with William III, King William III, at least his picture. I'll come back to him why he's important. There are 3 aspects of people are probably familiar with the term mercantilism, of course, and there are 3 aspects that are important. One, of course, is ensuring that the colonies existed almost entirely for the mother country, that this entire purpose was to exist for the mother country. To back up a bit, when the Iberian countries attempted to establish their colonies overseas, the need for mercantilism became extremely important. This idea of controlling the colonies existing for the purpose of the metropole, in this case, the metropolitan country. And for that purpose, for that argument, the metropolitan country became the center. For the King of Spain or the King of Portugal, or Queen of Spain or Queen of Portugal, the idea was that the colony existed as the private property of the metropole, and therefore all the organizations that were established for the purpose of constructing it. Well, when the British got into this, they established very much the same system. So mercantilism works upon this notion that colonies exist for no other purpose than to provide goods for the mother country, and that trade between countries must therefore be severely regulated by institutions, and that colonies existed entirely for the benefit of the metropole. Although these things existed, according to Limber and Rediker in the book Many-Headed Hydra, it was actually who gave us the word hydrarchy. They see this as beginning with the Civil War, with Oliver Cromwell as protectorate, and that competition over time began to, competition with the Dutch forced or obliged the English, the British in this case, to establish a system of mercantilism to control to deal with Dutch competition. For the sole purpose, and this is the key part of a hydrarchy, to protect the merchant marine. This required, among other things, navigation exports. Specifically, it would cause things such as exclusive trade with the English, as well as to protect English markets from foreign competition. This is the beginning of an English hydrarchy, or at least a reflection of the establishment and incarnation of it. By 1697, this particular individual, William III, of William and Mary fame, decided to establish a complete infrastructure for the purposes of governing this. And that, of course, would be the Board of Trade and Plantations. How this relates to Bermuda is rather interesting, because the first secretary of the Board of Trade and Plantations was a man by the name of William Popple, the grandfather of 2 governors of Bermuda, William Popple III and Alarid Popple. Incidentally, both of those 2 men would also serve as secretaries at one point of the Board of Trade and Plantations. What this also meant is that if there are a whole pile of countries creating hydrarchies, they're all going to be at each other's throats. And so what you have are multiple hydrarchies fighting each other for control of commercial and colonial domination. And that's sort of the background context for what would be, in the 18th century, one of the most violent periods of history in this case, or at least more violent than others. We have a series of wars that reflect that: King William's War, Queen Anne's War, War of Orson Succession, 7 Years' War, the British-American War. I've tried to British-American Revolutionary War, to distinguish it all from the other revolutionary wars that were occurring at the period of time. And last but not least, the French Revolutionary Wars, which will include the Haitian Revolutionary War. All of these reflect the conflicts that were between hydrarchies, ultimately became conflicts between these various hydrarchies for power. One more point. A conflict between metropolitan hydrocracy. There will also be conflict between the metropolitan elite and the colonial elite. Now we come back to the question of colonial hydrocracies. And in that case, this must be seen in three parts. One, conflict between colonial merchants versus metropolitan merchants, which is also how we would look at it between colonial maritime states and the country maritime states, colonies maritime states. And last but not least, between the metropolitan hydrarchy and the colonial hydrarchy. That takes us directly to the question of Bermuda and the establishment of Bermuda Hydrarchy from there. That's great. This requires us to go back in time. And let's go back to the early colonial period of Bermuda. 1609, of course, 1609, 1610 would be the sea venture period. By 1612, as we all know, the plow came back to Bermuda with Richard Moore as its first governor. What made Bermuda distinctly different, what made the British method of colonizing different from the method carried out by the Iberians was the fact that it would be done by a private company. Think for a moment what it would be like to to carry out colonial activity. Let's say to colonize the moon, for example. That requires a high amount of industrial and economic investment. The problem is no private individual person can do it, and it was oftentimes carried out by the crown. What the British and the Dutch and the French would later find out that it was actually easier to do this colonial activity by having a company, a private limited company in which the potential for failure would not ruin any individual who was a part of it. And that must be seen in the context of establishing the Virginia Company. Between 1612 and 1615, Bermuda was under the control of the Virginia Company, which included Virginia. By 1615, the investors that were part of that formed their own company, which would, of course, would be the Bermuda or Somers Island Company. Again, adventurers or investors would give money. Each of them would give shares and their shares into it, and therefore pool the financing of this very, very expensive operation, which was a colony. It is private rule versus government direct rule. And which means that for this particular period from 1612 to 1684, Bermuda is going to be run by a private company, literally by a board of adventurers, or in this case, investors. And the Bermuda method was going to be different in one way. In fact, each investor will own a share of land in the colony, which would be a separate system to what was even done somewhere else. Not that everything was perfect. By 1616, by the time Moore left, and before 1616, he left the control of the colony in the hands of several privateers, several individual governors. Some of them were privateers as well. I must establish context. I must give credit to a Millersville University student who researched this, Megan Schulman, in which he made the argument that these privateers were operating in complete contravention to the law established by King James I. King James I had already made it abundantly clear that pirates and privateers were not any different. He was trying to cozy up with the Spanish king at the time, and the Spanish king, of course, was very, very frustrated by the constant attacks of privateers. King James taking a completely different policy from that of his predecessor, Elizabeth I. But that didn't stop the Bermuda privateers, privateers. They continued doing that, even though they knew, as Ms. Schulman argues, even though they knew that this was in complete contravention of the law. And even though they knew that King James I made it abundantly clear, he ever got his hands on any one of them, he would hang them. But what it did do is it provided a lot of supplies for Bermuda at the time Bermuda absolutely needed them. But it also was a period of much difficulty and chaos, as these particular individuals' governing style was the least interesting. By 1616, they got a different type of governor, Old Dan Tucker. By the time Governor Tucker came to Bermuda, he would establish much more order in the organization in terms of governance. But several important events are going to occur under his governorship. Among them, the most significant for Bermuda's racial history is the arrival of the Edwin, which brought the first Negro and the quote Negro and the first quote Indian, and that's using the terms that they did, to Bermuda at the time. That also saw the Bermuda divided up into tribes, which of course be parishes. The 9 parishes today reflect that. And each parish, usually the largest investor having the credit of having his tribe or parish named after him. And also the continuation of that private share system in which each land was reflected in ownership of the, each land was reflected in the ownership of shares. They even coined their own, they even got their own coins. But it would be with another governor, and that would see another change and transformation in this early period of Bermuda. And that is, of course, under Nathaniel Butler, who served as governor. With it will accompany several extremely important events. Among them, the arrival of the treasure, which of course which connects Bermuda specifically with the history of Virginia as the ship that, there's the two ships that brought the first African-American, people would become African-American communities in Virginia. The second ship brought another group to Bermuda, all of them coming from Angola, all of them taken from Portuguese slavery. And then, of course, the building of the State House, which Nathaniel Butler, wanted to make, built on very much on the same, that he saw a variety of other buildings built in these latitudes, in which would be to the beginning of Bermuda's very particular architectural heritage. And of course, the meeting of the first colonial assembly in St. George's. This becomes this period, 1616, 1621, ends this particular era. That explains the early colonial period. Now we go to the question of the Hydrarchy. And I will use Francis Jones as my picture for this. Probably one of the longest serving presidents of Bermuda's Governor's Council. Several things that, as I said, the Bermuda Hydrarchy was in fact the establishment of a maritime state in Bermuda. And several things had to occur before that happened. One, of course, was the decline of Bermuda's tobacco agricultural economy in the 1600s. But there's also set forth, beginning in the late 1600s and establishing, exploding in the 1700s, the development of maritime and commercial revolution. And that maritime commercial revolution, of course, will have a wide impact in terms of Bermuda's, in terms, of course, establishment of this hydrarchy. Key to this was the Bermuda sloop. Evolving in the 1600s and fully developed by the 1700s, this ship was this became the workhorse for Bermuda's maritime economy. Low in the water, made out of Bermuda cedar, therefore resistant to the radar worm, able to sail in any wind, and one of the fastest ships afloat. It became, as I said, the workhorse of Bermuda's maritime economy, not needing that many men, but carrying a large amount of goods. What this meant was establishment of colonial, the first thing the Hydrarchies would do was be establishing colonial entrepôts throughout. It's good to see colonial shipping not as a kind of, although Bermuda didn't go all the way to England, I just sort of use this picture as a background, but it gives you an idea of that trading is much of the trade went everywhere. This is, just to be clear, this is not Bermuda's trade, but it gives an idea of the links that can cross the Atlantic. Bermuda would establish its trading systems within the Caribbean basin. And it's good to see these trades as circles, not lines, as they go back and forth. Particularly also the establishment of colonies. It is significant that in Bermuda, that the Bahamas' early history has as much of its early period as what is called that Bermuda period, primarily because Bermuda plays a very big role in the early establishment of the Bahamas, even for that matter in the establishment of Nassau. But the one thing that will be clear in Bermuda's continued establishment of maritime commercial activity would be, of course, its smuggling. But these are the activities, as we know. The carrying trade, which explained that, was basically carrying goods throughout from various points of the Atlantic world. That was the dominant activity carried on by Bermudian traders. That, of course, includes overseas smuggling and therefore setting up agents across the Atlantic to be able to connect with Bermuda. It also includes privateering. All of those wars I explained earlier meant that at various points in time, mostly with the French, the British found themselves at war. Bermudians therefore found that they could do well attacking shipping. Privateering is different from piracy, just for the sake of comparison. Privateering is basically the ability to attack other ships following certain rules under a letter of marque. It is therefore in a sense, state-sponsored assaults on usually specialized enemy shipping, and it was way more regulated. Piracy is not. Pirates have no rules, and they have rules for themselves, but they certainly do not come under a state in terms of management. So therefore, they can attack anyone. Privateers, of course, were much more regulated. War, therefore, was a big opportunity for Bermudian sailors. Wrecking, of course, meant finding where shipwrecks had gone down, and therefore going to them and taking goods regulated off the ship, sometimes not regulated, but sometimes regulated off the ships, and of course, whaling as another activity. This gives an idea of the number of ships and sloops that Bermuda had per parish. The largest and the most, which would make sense, would almost sort of serve as its own type of port, would be Southampton and Sands, where 1,124 ships were there, 936 for Sands, probably more than most places, of most of the parishes, in terms of tonnage, collective term, in terms of number of sloops, 18 and 15. They ultimately operated as almost like a separate port, and almost as a rival port to the port of St. George's, which would create its own particular history and own particular conflicts in this case, because many of them oftentimes found themselves in competition or in conflict with, and frustrated with the regulations that forced ships to have to go to St. George's before they went to Southampton and Sands. To show you how, I wouldn't say boastful, that's the word I'm looking for, arrogant, not arrogant, proud they were of their trading activity. They made this particular statement was made to Governor Bruer, that in these islands adjacent to Ili's Harbor and the harbor of Cromwell, 3/5 of all commodities are vended and sold. That was not an empty boast. They literally were in many ways the powerhouse of Bermuda's economy in maritime commercial activity, as we saw from the previous slide. And these were their ports, as we can tell from records given to us. As you can see, throughout the Caribbean, most interesting is the island of Saint Domingue. That, of course, is today, of course, the Republic of Haiti. Back then, it was the major power sugar-producing economy in the Atlantic world. In fact, it was considered to be the richest colony in the history of humanity. At least some people have said that. Therefore, its sugar was the most profitable. The problem with Saint Domingue was that it was absolutely illegal for anyone to trade with Saint Domingue, for any British ship to trade with Saint Domingue. But that, of course, didn't stop Bermudians from doing that. And therefore, they would trade with them and then more than likely smuggle goods back into either some neutral port or back into Bermuda. That way, they would get hold of some of the most desired sugar in the Caribbean basin. And then, of course, the St. Eustatius, which is oftentimes used as a filter to smuggle with Saint Domingue as well. I give Bishop Berkeley here because one of the reasons why Bishop Berkeley, Dean Berkeley at the time, wanted to establish his college in Bermuda was because of this commercial power. What he basically said is that it trades with all the places in the Atlantic world. Well, he didn't say Atlantic world, he had that concept, but to paraphrase him, to trade with all of these places in the Atlantic world, and therefore always be well supplied. That, therefore, he meant not only would it create and the other reasons, of course, was that he felt that the maritime commercial activity made and the relative, as he felt, poverty compared to the wealth of the Caribbean, sugar Caribbean colonies, which he saw on the border of decadence. This sort of frugality was the term he thought would be perfect as a sort of argument for Bermuda. Whatever the case was, that was his argument, that Bermuda would be a good place to establish trade. And this is an aspect of it was, if you like, the summary of the establishment of this maritime state, a creation of colonies and maritime partners, smuggling, and of course, privateering. But the politics of it is its most important, because what you end up having is most of the power in Bermuda was shifted toward the West End, not in St. George's. St. George's, of course, is just one parish, but it could be dominated just by the sheer numbers of assemblymen that came from what they called the country, and in this case, country traders. And these men, in many ways, were able to construct a hydrarchy that benefited their interest. But it also meant that this would cause conflict between various boards of various sectors of Bermuda's government. To describe it quickly, Bermuda, of course, had not only the Governor's Council, which was made up of not only the elites, but people selected by the governor, and the Bermuda House of Assembly, which of course was dominated by people who were elected into that position. It was what you ended up having, therefore, were what they called the assembly representatives of the country, and or more specifically, these powerful traders. And their resistance and frustration at the hand-picked, what they felt, Governor's Council, meant that there would be conflicts between branches. But as I said also, there were conflicts between regions, conflict between these regions in the West End and the St. George's, which was usually tended to support the governor of the day. I would argue, I use this phrase capitalism versus feudalism only in one aspect of these two particular ideas. If an aspect of capitalism is the distribution, is in which the market is governing the distribution of resources, and if feudalism has characteristics in which power and political power determine the distribution of resources, then what we end up having is, do we have, in a sense, a conflict between the distribution of resources in terms of power and distribution of resources in terms of capitalism? And of course, it's much more complicated than that. But what it suggests is the fact that there was a conflict in many ways between the ancien regime, in which mercantilism relied a lot on the power and the state to engage and to determine the distribution of resources. Free market capitalism was going to argue against that. And that sets the stage for what's going to be an important conflict later on between those people who speak for free market capitalism and those people who speak for mercantilism. It should come as no surprise that the American Revolution, or during the Anglo-American Revolution, that the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 should occur at the same time as the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. That indicates a bringing together of these two particular ideas. And that's the point. One was that there was a question of smuggling. Smuggling, therefore, becomes in many ways an active resistance by Bermuda's Hydrarchy, because it's more than just determining trade. It's determining Bermudians determining who they can trade with. Therefore, it didn't matter whether or not they traded with people who were at war with England or people who were not. And therefore, trading with the French was part of this particular act of resistance. Think for a moment of the, let's say, hubris, or sense of self-discipline, or sense of self-power, in which one basically argues that we can trade with whomever we feel like for the protection of our commercial interest. That was the idea behind the de facto element of Hydrarchy. And as I mentioned, much of this secret trade occurring with the French and the Spanish, in spite of the fact that throughout that period, the British were at war with the French and the Spanish. And during the time they were at war, the most egregious for the English occurred during the French and Indian Wars, or the so-called French and Indian Wars, otherwise the 7 Years' War, in which during that war, in spite of the fact that England was in clear violent confrontation with the French, and even in spite of the fact that there were privateers sailing on the seas that were supporting them, Bermudians traded with French colonies. So did North Americans, for that matter. And that would be an issue which many in North America, which the British would have when they complained about North American Revolution later on. And these are the hidden channels. Hidden channels which one took to get in and out secretly and to smuggle goods. The law at the time was that all goods had to be brought into St. George's first before they were distributed into the West End. Obviously, these folks were not going to listen to that. And they sort of brought their goods in at various points at various times throughout, regardless of bringing them into St. George's. Interestingly enough, this map by a Frenchman shows various ports and entrance places of entry. You can see by the lines that are in that lead into certain harbors. Perhaps suggestive, perhaps, that the French themselves were also engaging in trade with Bermudians. Not surprisingly, there's a conflict between Hydrarchies, and that sets the stage for this. I put Governor Popple in the middle because he was in the middle. Between, on the one hand, those people who wanted to force metropolitan mercantilism, on the other hand, the maritime state, the Bermuda's own maritime state, Bermuda's own Hydrarchy. That takes care of the Hydrarchy. what the maritime commercial revolution also created was a enslaved maritime community. And that takes us to the enslaved Thalassocracy. Before I get to that, I think it's probably useful for me to describe the constitution of a slave society. And these three I've mentioned in various other places, but it's probably good as a sort of refresher. In 1616, as I said, the first Black arrival occurs on the Edwin. He, as long as with the Native American arrival, arrived from Venezuela. The desire to go from, now this was under Governor Tucker, who had an ambivalent relationship with the question of privateers bringing goods in, and therefore also bringing people in. But in this case, these two were actually purchased. But later on, privateers would bring in captives from various other places, taken directly from ships that were Portuguese and Spanish ships. So between 1617 and 1618, privateers were attacking and bringing them, one particular so-called accidental Negroes, or so-called accidental Negroes by one of the governors, Kendall. When he was asked where they came from, the privateers said they were floating in the seas. But for the most part, majority of them were coming from Angola. All of them, perhaps, were coming from Angola, and this was definitely reflected in the treasurer. The ship that was in fact shepherded by or captained by a man named Daniel Elfrith. Daniel Elfrith was in partnership with Jean Yupi, and both of those two men attacked a privateer ship called the Salvador Batista. Those captives were on their way from Angola to South America, to Latin America. They were captured, taken from the ships, and brought to Bermuda. One group was brought to Bermuda. The other group, of course, went to Virginia. As I mentioned, all from Angola and Southwest Africa, all en route to the Viceroyalty of New Spain. The Portuguese at the time had what they call the hacienda, the right to supply Spanish countries with slaves. So what develops as an African community here? We start seeing the English start to utilize much of the terms that they found used by the Spanish. Mulatto is a good example of one of those. Criollo is another one, but they used the word Creole. These terms came from, and also did the term Negro. There was an evolution from an earlier term to this one. The other term, I think, would continue on, and in fact would become a term of abuse. But this one, Negro, would become the term used, and I would venture, I can't prove it, but I have a theory, I have a suspicion that this was a term that those people who came there wanted to be called. And that became the term that they used, the first group that came, because many of them came. Just a theory, perhaps I can't prove it. But for the most part, by 1630s, an indigenous population of a locally born population starts to emerge. And from 1630s onwards, Bermuda becomes notable for having a large Creole or locally born Black population, usually around about 90%. Later African arrivals will also occur, but although Bermuda has a large number of local enslaved, for this period have a large number of local enslaved, they would also be affected by events that are occurring in the shifting patterns of human trafficking that were occurring with Africa. And one of them, of course, was the shift from Angola to what we call the Lower Guinea shift, movement of the taking of captives from Angola to places that are probably familiar today as well. That would be the Gold Coast, which today is Republic of Ghana, the Slave Coast, as they were called, places that would include Dahomey, the Gold Coast, Ghana, and what would be Oyo, Nigeria, Ouida, and the rest of those. And of course, up to Senegambia as well. The interesting group was that a group would come from Senegambia later on. In fact, it was one of the few direct entries that occur in Bermuda. When a group of captives were brought by Daniel Johnson from Senegambia to Bermuda en route to the Carolinas. That would also, part of the reason for that was the fact because of rice production as well. They would need to have people who produced that. Native American arrivals also must be seen occur during this period. From the Caribbean Basin, Kalinago, Taino, and Yucatan. Interestingly enough, there was one reference to a person called Popelo of Somosenta who came from the Yucatan, more than likely of Mayan ancestry. So I put these pictures to demonstrate the wide range of Native American arrivals. But also from North America, a group, for example, of New York, group came from New York, or from women who were, in fact, they had been, in fact, Christian, and they were kidnapped and brought to Bermuda. They were then freed because it was realized that they were, because of the Christian, there were still the questions about Christian, kidnapping or enslaving people who were Christian. And they, of course, became part of the population. And of course, the Pequot Wars. There is a reference to Pequots being, captives being placed on a ship leaving from North America. Whether they came or not is another question, but there was definitely a reference to them being sent, or at least being asked for, a record of them being loaded on the ship. But there is also the shadow of human trafficking with regard to, as with West Africa was also, at this time, a lot of people were involved in the West were involved with transporting North America, American Indians to, Native Americans, North American Native Americans to the Caribbean basin. Again, to supply, particularly during the 1600s, particularly to supply this Spanish needs. The point, now this would take to the question of evolving from a society with slaves to a slave society. What's the difference? This phrase comes from Hilary Beckles when he made a distinction between a society that has slaves in it to a society in which there's an entire infrastructure used to govern the enslavement of people. And that brings to the question of indentured. From very, very early, there were two types, very early, indentured servants, but mostly enslaved, as we can see from the ships that came in. Indentured servitude was meant to be for 7 years, and supposed to, at the end of 7 years, a person was meant to get a freedom suit and be sent away. Majority of those of African descent were enslaved, though a couple show up as indentured servants. I'll come back to that because another form of indentured servitude will occur in which we have, instead of individuals enslaved, we have instead of having the 7-year enslavement of 7-year indentured servitude, we have something called the 99-year indenture. But the beginning of Bermuda's movement from a society with slaves in it to a slave society begins with the earliest record of regulation for the purposes of governing enslaved people in the British Americas. And that is the Act to Restrain the Instances of the Negroes, passed by the earliest Act of Assembly passed by Bermuda's House of Assembly. That, as I mentioned before, as they were getting closer and closer to, closer to the 1630s, many people found themselves in what we call 99-year indentures. While this is not necessarily enslavement, slavery implies the ownership of the body and its products. An indentured servant has some degree of leverage and therefore can in fact produce a person who's not enslaved. A child of an indentured servant is free. A slave, however, of course, does not. Enslaved person does not. And that was, in 99-year indentures, however, were somewhere the bridge between, in which it gave an opportunity to control someone's labor at least for 99 years. One of the issues that many who had indentured servants had was the fact that at the end of 7 years, one lost labor, that person's labor, and had to compensate the person. Slavery and a 99-year indenture obviously obviate that, get rid of that problem. So we have the development of a slave society, a movement in which we start seeing the phrase, which I would make the argument that there is a notion of Bermuda becoming a caste society in which race and slavery are conflated together. So what you end up having, this was reflected in the phrase Negroes and other slaves, with the implication of development of what can fundamentally be called a caste system, in which race becomes the marker of slavery. Even though not all slaves were blacks, there was certainly, and not all blacks would be slaves, slaves with the slavery and the slave condition become marked by race. There were, of course, acts of resistance. The first act of resistance occurs in 1656 that results in, the result of that one, and most of these were conspiracies. The conspiracy was discovered, and it was believed that a free black a man named William Force, there were a number of free blacks living in the colony at that time, had some involvement. They could never prove it, and they were unable to get him to admit to it, to even suggest that he was, and he probably wasn't, but it didn't matter. The rest of those who were punished, as regarding to William Force, the plan was that they would get rid of all free blacks from Bermuda. So in 1656, this began the practice of removing from Bermuda free blacks that would be intermittently carried out throughout Bermuda's history up until 1764. This is the beginning. And these particular free blacks were sent to an island, were sent to Segatu or Eleuthera in the Bahamas. They wanted that as a preference. It was more than likely they were going to send them to the Spanish Caribbean. But they insisted on being sent to Eleuthera. But the more famous conspiracies are the poison plot conspiracy, 1729 and 1730, for which involved Sarah Bassett. The interesting thing about this is that there were a number of people that were being poisoned. There was a number of complaints about poisonings that were occurring. So the governor at the time, Governor Pitt, decided that he was going to basically investigate all of them. The investigation focused specifically on Sarah Bassett, but a number of people were arrested as a result. Sarah Bassett, of course, is famous because she would end up being burnt to the stake as a result of it. The others were executed or sent away. As the governor put it at the time, one woman was hanged, one woman burnt, another man hanged, and the rest sent to the Spanish West Indies. That individual who was hanged was a man by the name of Kwaku, and that speaks to something. That Kwaku is, of course, an Akan Gold Coast name. And that also speaks to what happens afterwards, because there was the belief that there were a number of Gold Coast Africans in the colony who were probably driving this. There's possibility that at least two were involved in the poison plot conspiracies, who also were executed. But Sarah Bassett, of course, her immolation became the one memory that came out of this particular event. And the last major act of resistance was the Act of Conspiracy of 1761, in which a large number of, there was a belief under the governorship of William Popple. One of the things he found himself confronted with was the fact that a group of, there was overheard a number of people who said that the blacks in Bermuda were going to rise up and kill all of the whites in the colony. The event didn't occur. The conspiracy was stopped, and there were executions as a result of it. But what it also was interesting about this is the number of these men included people who were engaged in very, very close, who were probably engaged in the larger, broader maritime commercial activity. In fact, it was a good argument to suggest that what might have stimulated this conflict might have been the fear, might have been the fact that their governor at the time was beginning to control, was establishing even more control over the trade carried out by enslaved people. Interestingly enough, and this is clear from the statements made by some of the people who were alleged to be recorded, that no one will take a shirt from me, and if they take a cow from me, then they're going to that they will be avenged. Paraphrasing all of the statements. So there was definitely a sense that, and one has to remember, this is 1761, during the 7 Years' War, and the profitable activity that came from smuggling and the need to have enslaved people involved in smuggling. I'll come back to that in a few moments. But what it meant was that it was this act of control might have stimulated an attempt at a conspiracy of 1761. Therefore, this brings to the question of an enslaved thalassocracy. As mentioned, it is a maritime community, and that, among other things, is the creation of relationships and connections, and customs and stabilizations of institutions, customs to stabilize institutions and practices. These markets included a variety of different places across the Caribbean basin, and these associations allowed, put Bermuda enslaved mariners in various markets around the Caribbean basin. and therefore attending various markets around the Caribbean basin. So we end up having, as I said, an enslaved maritime community. How did it develop? To understand that, we have to go back to 1720. Between 1708 and 1720, there were a number of it, but number of Blacks involved and enslaved people involved in maritime activity. But after 1720, this number grew. The reason, of course, was one of the catalysts for this was more than likely Governor Benjamin Bennett's regulation that enslaved people, that in order to keep a number of whites on the island out of fear that they might be attacked, that the island might be attacked and they needed men of arms, increased the number of Blacks and enslaved people on these ships. What that meant was this allowed a locally developing market developed by enslaved people, which is attested to even in contrary legislation like the 1623 Act to Restrain, which specifically notices that and tries to control it. And most legislation at the time was attempts to try to control the commercial activity of enslaved people. By about this period of time, it meant taking that trade and commercial activity across the Atlantic and increasing it by basically taking advantage of a loophole created by need. There was also another reason for using enslaved people, because of a rule that made it illegal for an enslaved person to testify against his masters. That was a perfect person to use for an enslaved person, a perfect person to use for smuggling. So, if in some situations, white captains would get off the ship and turn the entire vessel over to enslaved people who were then able to do almost anything they felt like at that point, because no one's going to watch them and no one's going to stop them. No one's going to try to supervise them because they're far away, as long as they carried out whatever responsibilities they were required of them. And this is explained and very much described by people who actually saw them in places such as, like in Jamaica, where they would oftentimes be given the responsibility of engaging in direct commercial negotiations. And sometimes, of course, they would engage in commercial interactions for their own with planters and others. 40%, according to Lane Forman Crane, 40% of Black men were sailors, according to the census. And this is to give you an example of one particular man by the name of Henry King, in which 20 out of 27 men, enslaved bondmen, were in fact mariners. But think of them more than just mariners. There are not only mariners, there are also people who have wives and family members who could take their goods and trade them in market here. And they also have connections in the Caribbean basin where they can do very much the same thing, have connections who can trade their goods. This is implied, for example, in Mary Prince's book. In fact, when she herself operates as what is called, they call them higglers, people who traded at the port with goods and took those goods and traded them elsewhere, oftentimes for double and triple the price. It implied her own connections with maritime, perhaps Bermudians, it's possible, but certainly with maritime traders. So there was this network that was developed as well. And this, again, we know this largely from the laws that are established against them. And this is a good example. The Act of Assembly in 1730 was making it illegal and wanted to prevent people from selling goods overseas. These were called, notice the word here, sea adventures. These goods weren't just goods for use, personal use. These were goods of trade, otherwise known as capital. And they were using them to get other goods. And that is also must be seen in this context. This is more than just this is a full-fledged capitalist enterprise, oftentimes carried on beyond the knowledge and beyond the concern of some of their owners, until they came and figured out how much these folks were making. So trade was therefore, but oftentimes, again, these things would be regulated. And in the wake of the poison plot conspiracies, an act of assembly was passed to control commercial activity of enslaved people. To give an idea, if you ever read Olaudah Equiano's book, it's all in there. His activity of trading, his adventures, which can also be called profits, which also be called capital, he ultimately utilized to free himself in the 1760s. And again, for Bermudians, and I'm using him as an example, but Bermudians themselves will also engage, much of the places he traded with, Montserrat, St. Eustatius, Georgia, and Philadelphia, are exactly the places that Bermudian sailors. In fact, he himself encountered Bermudian mariners in one of his activities. And for Bermudians, they had For enslaved Bermudians, they too would have places of commerce. Leeward Islands, the French islands, as I mentioned before, Saint-Domingue, they would also become involved in some of those activities. Martinique, Guadeloupe, and of course, the Spanish Caribbean. What this implies is not just notion of ability, not just numeracy, but also, it also implies knowledge of languages as well. Many of these men and women, in short, but most of these sailors would in fact be able to speak a number of languages. And we also know they used this opportunity for literacy. Shipboard time allowed them to do the type of stuff that would be able to improve, like literacy. And we know that because we have a letter written, there was a letter, we never kept it, was never kept, but it was a letter in which one person was telling another about the dangerous market conditions that were occurring in New York. They were occurring in the wake of the 1741 conspiracy in New York. And Bermudians were trading there, and this particular person was basically telling, this particular enslaved sailor was telling another enslaved sailor, don't go to New York because New York is dangerous for places as a place of trade. And all of these must be seen. The phrase that Michael Jarvis uses, the Commonwealth, fits well here. A maritime community is established in the Caribbean basin. This was the network of which these folks traded and engaged in trade. And key to this, in marketing goods on land were women who used the goods that were brought from this trade to engage in more commercial activity. As I spoke about, the example of Mary Prince is a good example of that. In fact, many of these women also had vendor stands, which many of these sailors would go to get drinks. So probably an early example of getting liquid refreshment from vendors. I'm using the name for that. Several points that must be made about this. Number one, interestingly enough, a racial restriction would become an exploitable technique. Yes, race made it impossible. Yes, there were racial and racist restrictions, but one of them was quite useful. That meant being involved in smuggling, and that meant being able to carry out one's own smuggling activities. And as I mentioned, skills such as literacy, numeracy, as well as language skills developed in the context of this, outside of the commercial thing. And of course, accumulation of profit, adventures through trading and privateering by captives, by enslaved people. But here's the problem, and that is that what you have is a meeting between two things. A world in which goods access to goods are determined by the market, and a world in which access to goods are determined by politics. And those are going to clash because racism, as well as slavery, demands that power determines the distribution of goods, where in this case, market capitalism determined that the market did. What you end up having is a conflict, and I would make the argument in 1761 that conflict was very, very rough, very, very clear in that conspiracy. It implied the attempt by the state to control market activity, which resulted in a backlash. In other words, the enslaved sailor was kind of like a strange contradiction in and of himself that would make a Marxist happy. And that is that he was both the notion, or unhappy, the notion of both a capitalist, a person of capital, as well as a person of enslavement, of power, when a person's complete political domination. Those things coming together in one person. And as I mentioned, this sort of feudal elements, a conflict between with capital and power clashing, ultimately resulted, and I would argue, in the conspiracy of 1761. This brings to the economics of treason. This phrase comes from my partner in work and my former student, Alexandra Maris-Kessler. And she wrote an article on economics. She used this phrases from her, which I think completely encapsulates the very nature of the conflict that was occurring here. But in order to, I know this is a bit of Northern British American history, but I need to set this up as a context to explain this. So bear with me as I go over stuff which I'll mention stuff which we already know. And that is, of course, that we know what was the background to the American crisis. Between 1756 and 1763, we know the fact that the British emerged as one of the most powerful countries in the Atlantic world, having defeated the second most powerful country in the world, which was at the time was the French. The French, of course, and the Spanish with them would sit and grumble about this for several times, and they'll get their revenge later on in the American Revolution and Anglo-American Revolution. But the problem is that anyone who was involved in that didn't get it. And that was the problem, as we know, with the British. From the British point of view, their argument was that why should the British taxpayer fully have to take the full brunt of a war that helped to liberate American colonies and protect American colonies from the enemy, as they saw them as the French. So of course, a lot of what you end up having, not just attempts to force them to participate in paying down the debt, as we know, but also to control what you see is a far greater, more aggressive regulation of the navigation acts and all the new navigation acts that would occur. Up to this point in time, a lot of corruption occurred and allowed people not to have to pay. It comes as significant that the first person, the man who would sign the Declaration of Independence with the biggest signature, would earlier that time had to have been arrested for smuggling. And that's the point. So that was what was at the root of all of this. It was this sense that need to pay down the debt, of course, and the crackdown on violations. And we all know the result. But there were this is the sort of merchant view of what was happening with the American Revolution, Anglo-American Revolution, but there's also a bottom-up view, because all throughout that period, there were impressments and taking them and sending them into the British Navy, or into the Royal Navy. So there was conflict from the ground and a conflict from above that ultimately result in uprisings throughout and complaints mostly against the increasing taxation and among other things. By the way, the British had another argument, and was that while we were fighting the war, they argued, the North Americans were engaging in trading with the French. So, their feeling about the war was a little different. And by the way, Equiano would support the British cause in this one. At any rate, we all know the context of the first casualty, of course, is Crispus Attucks, an Afro-American in the Boston Massacre. Afro-American protests in the Boston Massacre. And of course, we know about the Boston Tea Party, but there were several tea parties in which the tea got thrown overboard because of the, not from this case with taxation, because they were forced to have to buy it from the East India Company. So that was the American crisis. What this meant, of course, as the crisis was beginning to form and develop, and it was moving from protests to people beginning to form associations, to ultimately forming coming together to form a Congress that act as a sort of first as a protector or as a promoter and defender of American interests and pushing the American argument, and ultimately beginning to take action against the British. The formation of the Continental Congress would be the first act. But one of the things they would do in order to push the British, negotiations were getting nowhere with this, and the result, of course, was that, and even as late as the Olive Branch Petition, they would never get anywhere. And in fact, this absence of movement resulted in the Continental Congress taking one last major step against the British government. And that, of course, was the embargo. Now, that embargo is probably one of the most, the toughest, if I can use the word, the toughest action they could take against the British, but it also created problems for Bermuda because it meant all British goods would not be allowed into North America. We know about the exchange of gunfire, and even at this moment, the violence was, of course, not revolutionary. It would not become, I would make the argument, it would not become revolutionary until 1776. At this moment in time, people were still seeing themselves as a way of pushing the British to changing their policy with regard to them. But by July 3rd and July 4th, that all ended. And the radicals in the group managed to have already put together a larger declaration. And of course, the Declaration of Independence was signed. That embargo, of course, threatened Bermuda. And so what that meant was there had to be a Bermuda exception. That Bermuda exception, basically what Bermudians were wanting was quite simple. They wanted to have, their argument was quite simple. They wanted to make sure that they could still trade with North America in exchange for, to make an exception for them, to continue the mercantile interest between Bermuda and North America. I'll come back. And hopefully to get an assurance that that they would not retrade their goods, American goods, into any British port. American revolutionaries, therefore, would agree. They would, and the consequence, of course, Benjamin Franklin met with Colonel Henry Tucker, and as well as Robert Morrison. They both would come to it was actually Benjamin Franklin's idea. If you steal the gunpowder, this will be the first act of good faith with regard to this particular activity. And that will ensure that we can make an argument. Up to this point in time, Henry Tucker was getting nowhere with the Congress. And the deal was made, and the result, that was the consequence. The consequence was that Bermuda would continue to trade with North America. It can take its goods from in exchange for the gunpowder stolen. That gunpowder, by the way, would be used against British insurgents, the British government, British soldiers rather. Gunpowder stolen, Bermuda exception was granted. Bermuda would be allowed to trade with North America. It would also trade its goods with the French, which is, by the way, what that means is that when the French joined the war, this would be go from an it would be a total act of treason, because it meant that they were actually, again, Bermudians found themselves also trading with the French, with the people who were enemies of the crown, to protect their own hydrarchy. And the result, of course, is that gunpowder, molasses, other products that would be in exchange for bread basket goods. Unsurprisingly, Governor Burrell was furious, and there were passive-aggressive attacks upon, much of them aggressive, spite attacks on Bermudians and privateering attacks by the Royal Navy. But he found himself frustrated, and this would lead to having to come up with another system to deal with trade, people whom they felt were traitors. My other student, Alexander Goodrich, talked about that too, in which he talks about how the governor brought about, decided that he was going to use privateers to attack Bermudian vessels. By the way, this smuggling fitted well with thalassocracy, because what that meant was it gave enslaved sailors an opportunity to engage as supercargos to do everything as they did before, which also meant that the black trading emporium would continue. And this will give you an idea of just how much goods were made by enslaved sailors during this period. One particular enslaved sailor and privateer. So that, not surprisingly, the governor would strike out against that too. The act to prevent the vending, retailing goods, wares, and merchandise by Negroes, mulattoes, musties, whether bond or free. The real purpose of all of this, again, was to control trade and curtail trade carried out by enslaved people during this profitable period. I'll come to a couple of conclusions. Number one, the result, of course, in Olive Branch will be there would be a rapprochement with Bermuda's hydrarchy by Britain, and resettlement of economic insurgents elsewhere. But also, for the enslaved, a new era was going to develop in which they were going to start to enter something called the humanitarian revolution, which could be described elsewhere. This humanitarian insurgency will be the next stage of their activity. As they begin to find there was a new ally in their activity. I conclude by this statement: people make history, but in the context that shapes them. And that sort of summarizes that question about actions and inactions, in the sense that that people make history by what they're inherited with, that in a sense it allows for their freedom as individuals, but they do it shaped and determined by the heritage which they're given. Thank you.
I'm having some technical difficulties with my video. My apologies. Dr. Maxwell, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you very much. I know that we've run on a little bit longer than we had anticipated, but I'm delighted with the content. I wish we could have a collective applause. I don't know if everyone has that in their chat, but I would, if we were together physically, I would love to just love to give you some praise for the amount of information that you have delivered in such a very short period of time. And I really appreciate how you pulled that together. Now we have offered to the audience, please, an opportunity for questions and answers. So if you are able to stay on, please do. And if you can submit your question to the chat, then because of the technical issues that I'm having, I'm going to have someone will be sending me what that question reads or says, and I will deliver that back to the group. So we are pausing for a question. Unfortunately, I can't see the slide. Let me see if I can go back to see the slide. Okay. Now the teacher in me is saying we'll give you a couple of moments to have a think on that question because that's a lot to take in. Okay, so here's one question, Dr. Maxwell, you hearing me as well? Okay. To what extent does racialized enslavement in Bermuda borrow from other English holdings like Jamaica, Barbados, and South Carolina?
Extensively. Think of the people who established many of these systems did so in working with each other. So what you end up having, Barbados in particular provided some of the infrastructural ideas for some of the later, for Bermuda. So you have, so it's, you ultimately, sometimes you see legislation in various places and they actually resemble each other. And primarily because there's an attempt to construct it. So that's where so the answer is yes, they very much depend, you work with each other to develop a system of laws, particularly, and much of it was particularly driven by Barbados because they had gone from, in 1650 to later on, it entered the sugar revolution. So they were beginning to come with really, really restricted systems for the management of enslaved people. So, and then later on, so there's a lot of back and forth.
And so we're looking at sort of the parallels then between the treatment across the Caribbean islands. Yeah.
There's attempted uniformity of regulation as well, yes. And the aspects of each occur in various parts.
Now I'm just waiting to see if there are other questions. One moment. While we're waiting for another question, what I would ask is I want everybody to remind that we do have a third question that we position for the lecture and that we will be posting on an additional slide, a link to that Google Doc, which allows for people to respond. Okay, here's another question, Dr. Maxwell. How can economic patterns of the past benefit us now and in the future, considering the current economic climate? It's a big question.
We can take a look at what people used and were reacting to in the past, and then take elements of that and apply it to the present. And that, I think, is the value of history. History is not about, I was talking to Dr. Atwood yesterday, and one of the things we mentioned is almost history is in many ways another country. But it's not entirely irrelevant. So we can take, if we have a strong historical memory, we can take elements that we see and use those elements for the present and try to figure out whether or not we can use that to deal with the problems that we have today. So that's a sort of general explanation. And if you find out with nations that do have very long, deep understandings of their history, this is exactly what they do. They use the elements and the cultural elements and reapply them. That's sort of implied in that statement. Man makes history in the context, or humans, the people make history in the context that shape them. What it basically means is that they take the heritage of that and apply it. So broadly speaking, without any specific example, I think we can use certain aspects of the past and apply it to and test it out against the present, particularly as history repeats itself.
Right, exactly. Well, it's interesting too, because there's such an important role of science, which is going to deflect the way in which the patterns of illness and a global pandemic. It's really fascinating to see the role of science and technology and its value to our contemporary world. I think a final question. What are two examples of the key defining elements that have shaped the context of Bermuda, in particular the legacy that we can draw on?
That's a big one, because I have to pick which ones, and it's hard to find a single one. But
or perhaps an adaptation.
Adaptation, I would imagine. One would occur later than this period. That is 1834, construction of a post-abolition society. But that would be the first one, because that sort of structures every society, and it's particularly significant because one of the Bermuda was involved in that. In this case, Mary Prince. But also, I think when we shifted, when the politics shifted into there's a recurring theme of conflict, if you like, between private and public, which I think is a feature of this place, which is not once, and it shows up both in all connections, black, white, whatever. There's always a conflict between private and public, and it's reflected in something like the Conspiracy of 1761, for example, which ultimately set up a new system of slavery. But also in 1684, when Bermuda went from being controlled by a private company to basically having as a crown colony, but also still managing its own affairs. Because at that moment, it starts to begin to develop its own political identity.
Well, that's also setting up quite well, actually, the next lecture. From my perspective, to be getting into where and how do these adaptations continue as we go forward. So there are a lot more questions that are in the chat, and I think what we will do is we'll follow those up in an email. And thank everybody so much again for your time. I see that because I flip between video and slide, I can see that the link has been posted in order for people to be able to submit their responses. So we'd love to hear from you. And then the last is that we encourage people to come back tomorrow, to the educators and parents who are looking for further insight. And in tomorrow's session at 10 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Clarence Maxwell will also be present, providing a summation of the lecture. And don't know if I just got kicked off, but I'm going to finish speaking. To say that there will be a summation and a continuation of the dialogue. Thank you very much.